Well, I would like to talk to you a little bit about the Jesus of history and the Christ of faith, because that has been sort of my life's journey. And I have a few slides that I would like to share with you, but I really would like this to be also a conversation with you, because I've been so impressed with this congregation. So I'll talk for a few minutes and I will show you a few things that may be of interest to you, but then I would love to have some questions from you, and we can explore a little bit more the Jesus of history and the Christ of faith. And why I say that is because the search for the historical Jesus is really a very unique strand of biblical scholarship. It was begun in the it was begun in the late 19th century, but in this country, it gained impetus, if you will. In the 1960s, John Dominic Crossan is one of the pastors who have been very much behind that effort. And what we try to do is to reconstruct the life and times of Jesus based on a historical analysis of the Gospels on the one hand, and all the other data that we as scholars can gather about this critical time in the time of Jesus. Now, this morning during my sermon, I gave you a little glimpse of the tremendously difficult socioeconomic conditions that were present when Jesus launched his ministry. And in many ways, the years before that, I think, inspired his ministry to focus on the hungry and the dispossessed and the oppressed. And so for us as biblical historians, it's really trying to understand the living person of Jesus as a fully developed human being. He was, of course, the Son of God, but while he was on earth, he lived and breathed like any of us, a fully developed human being. And when I give this talk, and I've given this talk many times, I'm often asked, you are a believer, right? And I say, yes. And they say, well, does digging into the historical context of Jesus, does that challenge your faith in any way? Is there a conflict, perhaps? Are there things that are not quite in agreement? And I say, of course there are. But does it really matter? I mean, the Gospels are not a history book, you know. They're not a book designed to write whatever happened in those critical decades in the opening century, the first century AD. They are a testament of faith. And as such, they bring together all of the ideas that galvanized Jesus in his ministry and inspired the communities that came after that to ultimately write that down. And of course, as historians, we look at the objective data that we can uncover and excavate, literally dig in the soil and excavate through archaeology. But for me, as a believer, my research in the historical Jesus has strengthened my faith. It really has. Because Jesus for me is now so much more a living figure in my life because of the additional information that I've been able to develop, not only myself, but with my peers in biblical scholarship, that I don't think we have to fear the historical Jesus. And as I said this morning, literally in 2 weeks, we're going to start production on a 15-episode series. I will show you the title at the end of this little talk. And that's the aim of that TV series, 15 episodes, in which we will try to get closer to this figure who is so important in our lives today, 2,000 years later, and he's still an important presence. So let's talk a little bit about how the Gospels came about and how we as historians look at that particular development. In the late 30s, in the mid to late 30s, now this is all hypothesis, this is not written in stone, this is all our particular interpretation. There were in Galilee and in the greater Palestinian region various oral traditions about Jesus. As far as we could tell, nobody in his immediate orbit, the apostles, they were fishermen, they were not literate, they knew all about fishing, but they were not scribes. So for the first decade or so, word about what Jesus did and said was communicated through what we call oral strata, oral traditions. People talking to one another saying, did you know what he said? Did you hear what he said? Did you hear what he did? Remember when he was there on that mountain? Remember the things he said? And so these oral strata circulated, not only in Roman Palestine, but through the Eastern Mediterranean. And at some point, these oral strata were written down in what we call sayings documents. Now, if you know a little bit about antiquity, sayings documents are a very, very prominent and very frequent record of famous folks. Plato created sayings documents about Socrates. Very often I'm asked at talks like this, well, did Jesus really exist? Because we don't really have a picture of him. There's no Instagram account that we can know of. I haven't seen a birth certificate. And my answer is always, it's the same with Socrates, the Greek philosopher. We know nothing about Socrates. We don't have an image of him. We don't have anything that he himself wrote. Everything we know about Socrates is what we know from his disciple Plato. And nobody will argue that Socrates was ever a real person. And the same is true with Jesus. Even though we don't have any contemporary documents from him, regretfully, we don't have any contemporary portraits of him because ancient Judaism forbade the depiction of living beings. You could not create a drawing. You could not create a painting or a sculpture of Jesus within ancient Judaism, the law against graven images. We have to wait until the 3rd century when Christianity expands into the Eastern Mediterranean, places like Asia Minor, which we now call Turkey. In Rome, that's when, on the catacombs in Rome, that's when for the first time we see Jesus. And those first depictions, they're really wonderful because the first depictions of Jesus depict him as an Apollo. Because to the Roman mind, that's the god he most resembled. So the earliest depictions in the Roman catacombs, you see him as an Apollo. And then the Greek culture moves in and he gets a beard and he becomes a Greek philosopher. And then more later on, it develops. And then in the Orthodox tradition around the Byzantine Empire, he becomes God Pantokrator, the all-powerful. And I'm sure you've seen those icons on the apse of these beautiful Greek Orthodox churches. When that image then shifts to Europe, an entirely different image develops. The Christ of the Passion, the Christ suffering under the cross, suffering under the terrible torments that they inflict on him. And if you're interested in that, I wrote a book, my first book for National Geographic, called The Biblical World, where I actually traced that. I see lots of pictures of the different images of Jesus. And amongst them is a forensic recreation, a British forensic specialist who works with Scotland Yard, when they have mortal remains of a person who has been dead for a long time. He's able to use a skull, for example, and to recreate what that person once looked like. And he actually went to Palestine, to Israel, and found a skull from the time of Jesus. And he then created, with his unique technique of wax and hair, what not Jesus, of course, but what a person from the time of Jesus would have looked like. And it is just an astonishing image. And so you'll find that in my book, The Biblical World. But anyway, I'm a little off topic here. So we have these saying strata. Sorry about that. And one of these saying strata This is like, as an archaeologist, I call it a stratum. A stratum is a layer, So when we excavate a hill, it's almost like a German cake, because you have all these different layers. And every layer represents a particular period in time, because people would build on top of what was there. Cities were rebuilt, destroyed, rebuilt, destroyed, rebuilt many, many, many times. And so one of those layers we call the oral strata of the oral witnesses who carried word of Jesus through the ages. And then at one point, and we believe it should be around the 40s, in the mid-40s, some of those sayings were then documented, were written down for the first time. And if you want to see what those sayings documents look like, and they are so close to the historical Jesus, they are so close, it's almost like somebody, a court recorder, was sitting there while he was speaking and writing it down, is the Gospel of Thomas. You can Google it, and you can download it for free. There are many, many different versions of it circulating on the internet. Jesus says, and then follows a statement. Wonderful, wonderful document that really brings us very, very close to historical Jesus. Well, it is these documents that then begin to serve for the first documents that we know now as the New Testament. And the oldest Christian documents, believe it or not, are the letters of Paul. They are the oldest Christian documents in the New Testament today. And so we think we're talking about the early to the mid-50s of the first century. If you have my book, The Archaeology of the Bible, you will see that Paul refers to Erastus, a Greek governor at the time. And in Delphi, in Greece, we actually found a limestone plaque with the name Erastus. There he is. So that allows us to date his letters very, very, very carefully to 52, 53 AD. Wonderful, wonderful documents of Paul that we just heard this morning about love. That's my favorite excerpt from the letters of Paul. And then we have the first gospel. The first gospel is actually that of Mark. In the New Testament, it's Matthew who comes first, because Matthew is considered perhaps the most beautiful, the most wonderful, poetic. Matthew is really a poet, His Greek is so beautiful, unlike that of Mark. The Greek of Mark is the Greek of the marketplace, Give me 2 peaches. How much is it? 5 denarii. Here you go. His Greek is not very polished, let's say. He was a very good evangelist. I'm not saying anything bad about poor Mark, but he was not a poet like Matthew. And he was not a historian like Luke. Luke is the historian, When Luke writes about something, he always puts it in the time frame. Emperor Augustus, Governor Quirinius, which to us is great stuff, because we know these guys. We know when they reign, and so we can really try to figure out when all this takes place. The Gospel of Mark, in my interpretation, and you don't have to take my word for it, was prompted by the fact that in 66 AD, a terrible war broke out. Today, we live through a terrible war as well. The war at that time was a rebellion. The Jews in Palestine and ancient Judea rose up against their Roman oppressor and launched a rebellion to cleanse the world, their world, of all pagan influences. The first Jewish rebellion. And guess what? They got together, and with just a hard scrabble group of people, farmers with pitchforks, very much sort of like the wonderful defense that we see in Ukraine right now. They were able to defeat not 1, not 2, but 3 Roman legions. Now, a Roman legion, these were veterans. They had been all over Europe and Asia, and they had fought a war, and they were well armed. And they were defeated. And for 3 glorious years, they ruled the land of Israel as it once was, as a land of God, as the kingdom of God that Jesus had talked about. And then, unfortunately, Rome sent an expeditionary force under Vespasian, and a very heavily armed army that landed in Galilee, and then for the next year and a half proceeded to reconquer all of Palestine. And I believe that the outbreak of that war prompted the community in which Mark was such an important disciple to say, you need to write this down. You need to write this down. Why? Because this was a community of Jewish Christians in Rome, believing in Jesus, but they were also Romans. They were also Romans, and they saw their sons and daughters go off to fight the war far away in Judea. And so it was important for them to say, Mark, you have to write down the story of Jesus, but make sure that we are not fighting against Rome as those Jews are doing in Judea. Even though we believe in Jesus, the Son of God, we are faithful Romans. And so you see that in the Gospel of Mark, the blame for killing Jesus, for the murder of Jesus, is shifted away from Pilate to the people of Jerusalem, to the Jews, through this amnesty. Who do you choose, Jesus or Barabbas? Pilate says. And then the Jews clamor for Barabbas to be released. And they say, well, what should we do with Jesus? What has he done? And they say, crucify him. And that's where it starts. Now, historically, that is very difficult to confirm. There were no amnesties that we know of in Roman Palestine, and Pilate was an incredibly cruel figure. He was merciless. In fact, 5 years after the crucifixion, the man who killed Jesus, Pontius Pilate, was evicted, was dismissed from his position as prefect of Judea because of excessive cruelty. Now, to be removed by the Roman Senate for cruelty, you have to be very bad indeed. So to think that this man became an advocate of Jesus, with all due respect to Mark, is difficult to defend, because clearly it was Pontius Pilate who condemned Jesus to the cross. And see, this is sort of where the historical Jesus and the Christ of faith, there is a little bit of a tension there in us as scholars. I mean, how do we reconcile that? Well, I think in the end, it doesn't really matter. The important thing is that Jesus died on the cross for our sins. And what exactly the machinations were that brought him to the cross, well, we can argue about that. But it doesn't take anything away from the core tenets of our faith, that Jesus was the Son of God who died for our sins. I've got to stay on the program here, because pretty soon we'll be here for 2 hours and I got to get ready for the next liturgy. The Gospels of Matthew and Luke were then written about 15 years later. And Luke and Matthew wrote with the Gospel of Mark on their lap. Somehow they got a copy of Mark, and they literally copied. There was no copyright in those days, no copyright issues, no patent office. 2/3 of Mark are actually brought into Matthew and Luke, which is why we call those 3 Gospels, Mark, Matthew, and Luke, the Synoptic Gospels, from the Greek word synoptikos, which means seen through the same lens. The Gospel of John, of course, is very different. But before we get that, the Acts of the Apostles, that wonderful book that follows the Gospels, was written by Luke. The same Luke, the evangelist, also wrote the book of the Acts of the Apostles. Then we have the Gospel of John, which is a very developed, very sophisticated gospel. Unlike Mark, who just basically wrote down what he saw, on his little laptop. The Gospel of John is very erudite. It's very developed. This is an intellectual we're talking about. And he tells the story with these beautiful flourishes, this wonderful dialogue between Pontius Pilate and Jesus. What is truth? Remember that? Beautiful, beautiful gospel. And then, of course, there's Revelation and other letters. So by the end of the first century, we finally have most of the documents in place, but then it's not until the 4th century that this canon, we call it the canon of the New Testament, was actually confirmed, because there were many, many other gospels in circulation at the time. Now, there is something very important that you have to try to understand, and it's a little difficult, so please bear with me, okay? I believe there is such a thing as moral truth. And as biblical historians, we must keep in mind that what we perceive as truth is different from the way truth was perceived in biblical times, in the times of Jesus. We believe it's true if we see the footage on CNN or Fox, depending on your political orientation. If we see the footage, we believe it, right? If we can read it in the paper, the Houston Chronicle, I think is your paper, right? If we can read it in the Houston Chronicle, it's true. Or not. But that's not what happened in the time of Jesus. There was no web. There was no internet. For some of the young people, that may be hard to imagine, but there was no Instagram in those days. We don't have selfies of the apostles. And so because there was no way to illustrate their stories, the prophets of the Hebrew Bible, all the way through the Gospels, they use another form of illumination, another form of illustration. And that form of illustration is the language of symbolism, of allegory. Let me give you an example. For example, we know that Jesus dwelled in the wilderness for 40 days and 40 nights without food. Luke 4:1. Now, purely from a medical point of view, that is, of course, impossible. And if we were thinking with our 21st century hat on, we would say, you can't do that. You can't be in the desert of all places for 40 days without food or water. You'll die. But that's not what the evangelists try to tell us. Because in biblical times, symbolism was so important. And 40, the number 40 is a number of completion. It is a number of perfection, of preparation for something wonderful to begin. So, for example, the Israelites dwelled in the desert for 40 years before their entry into the Promised Land. And according to ancient Jewish law, when Mary gave birth to Jesus, she was ritually impure for 40 days. Again, a time of coming together, of completing the cycle. That's what the evangelists are telling us. And so it's important to have that third dimension of symbolism in our mind. Another thing that is interesting is the Nativity. You know, Jesus was born, we think, in either 5 or 4 BC, not the year 1, according to our Gregorian calendar. And the reason is that the Gospels are very clear that Jesus was born when King Herod the Great was still very much alive. Well, King Herod died in 4 BC. So Jesus must have been born in 5 or 4 BC. And Luke says, Mary and Joseph then went to Bethlehem because a census sent them there under Quirinius. And we know Quirinius is a historical figure. Thank you, Luke. It's a historical figure. So again, we can pinpoint that particular thing. But Matthew says something else. He says Mary and Joseph were actually living in Bethlehem. They didn't have to come from Nazareth. They were living there. Matthew uses the word oikia, which is the word for home. They were at home when the star of Bethlehem reached them. Now, what the evangelists, again, are trying to do, they're trying to relate the birth of Jesus to a wonderful prophecy of the prophet Micah, who said, "And you, Bethlehem, in the land of Judah, for you shall come a ruler who is to shepherd my people Israel." So, for the Jews of his time, the Messiah had to come from Bethlehem, of course, the house of David, right? Joseph was from the house of David. So these are all wonderful allusions, wonderful allegorical embellishments, if you will, that tell us about how we should see the depth behind these texts. Now, one thing that I've been very interested in is these so-called lost years of Jesus, that there is no information about Jesus as a young man, as a boy, as a young man, other than this one story when he was 12, as you know, he went to the temple and he taught the scribes and the scholars in the temple. Other than that, we have absolutely no information whatsoever until, as a man of about 30 or 34 years old, he joins a leading dissident in the wilderness called John the Baptist. And this is where we as historians can sort of fill the gap. So it's not just a matter of finding ways in which the two are sometimes in conflict with one another. We can also complement each other as historians and with the Gospels. We can complement there where there are gaps in the Gospel story. And this is really a great story because since about 2003, various archaeologists have been working on a place called Sepphoris, or Zippori in Ivrit, in modern Hebrew, located just some 4 miles outside of Nazareth. I've been there many times. We're going to be filming there again in a few weeks, God willing. And this is a wonderful place because what happened is that Herod Antipas, the son of Herod, hoped to become the king of Judea after his father died. But Augustus says, no. I'm sick and tired of these sons of Herod. We've had lots of trouble with Herod. So we're going to divide up his kingdom. Galilee went to Antipas. Judea went to Archelaus. And the Gaulonitis, the Golan, went to Philip. So these three sons divvied up his kingdom. And then Archelaus he made a dog's breakfast of his rule, so that Augustus had to fire him in 6 AD. And then Herod Antipas was standing there saying, Emperor Augustus, hello, I can now become the king. And Augustus says, no, we're not going to do that. We're going to make Judea a crown province, and we're going to faithfully put a prefect on top of that. A Roman prefect is going to rule Judea. And that's, of course, how we got Pontius Pilate. And Herod Antipas was so disappointed that he said, well, you know what? I'm going to behave as if I'm a king. And so he decided to build a vast new city in Sepphoris, just 4 miles outside of a little village called Nazareth. Now, we know that Joseph was a tekton, as Matthew tells him, which we always translated as carpenter. But it really means, as I said earlier, a handyman. Jesus, who of course walked in his footsteps, would not be involved in the biggest construction project of their time, which happened to be just a few hours' walk from Nazareth. So the reason why we don't hear about Jesus for that long stretch of time is because Joseph and Jesus were involved in building this city in Sepphoris. You can see here the main boulevard, sort of the Fifth Avenue. It's called Cardo in Latin, the main Cardo. That's where they built. And some archaeologists believe that Jesus and Joseph were specifically involved in building this Roman theater because it required a lot of skill. And of course, as we know from the Gospels, Matthew had that skill. And so there are lots of other things that historical research can sort of amplify our understanding of Jesus. Jesus and the Pharisees. You know, sometimes we get the impression when we listen to the Gospels that the Pharisees and Jesus were somehow in collusion with one another. There's even a reference in Mark that they were plotting to conspire against him. We don't see that in Matthew and Luke, only in Mark. And I believe that's not entirely correct. Because Jesus and the Pharisees agreed on so many things that they did not agree on with the Sadducees. The Sadducees was the priesthood who ran the temple, the second temple. I'll have a little picture of that in a minute. They believed, the Pharisees and Jesus believed, that sacrificing an animal at the temple of Jerusalem was not going to get you off the hook. You had to live a moral life. Both the Pharisees and Jesus said that. They both believed in the immortality of the soul. They both said, let's talk about these things. So when the Pharisees go out and seek out Jesus, that is not necessarily to entrap him, but because they felt, here's a guy who knows what he's talking about. Let's see what he has to say about the Sabbath. Let's see what he has to say about the marriage laws, about the purity laws. Did they always agree? No, of course not. But these intense debates that we see in the Gospels was the bread and butter for Pharisees. When they got together, they were screaming at each other, debating how to apply the law, the Torah, to the everyday pressures of life in Roman Galilee. So that's why I think that they were closer to one another than we might think. Let's not forget, Joseph of Arimathea was a Pharisee who gave his tomb to Jesus. Paul was a Pharisee. Gamaliel, who got the apostles off the hook when they were in front of the Sanhedrin in the years after the Easter events, he was a Pharisee and he got up. So I think there was a lot of sympathy between these two. The attack on the money changers is something that has always really fascinated me, because here is the Prince of Peace, right? And he takes his belt and he goes after these people in the temple. What on earth prompted that? Well, we now know what happened, because in 30 AD, the high priest Caiaphas decided to move the sale of lambs to be slaughtered on the eve of Passover. Now, that market, can you imagine? Lots of blabbing and noise and all that stuff, was always located on the Mount of Olives. If you've been to Jerusalem, you know the Mount of Olives, right opposite the temple. That's where the sale of those lambs was held. The problem was that the lamb to be slaughtered and offered on Passover was supposed to be without blemish. Well, if you know the geography of the Mount of Olives, and then this valley of Kidron, and then the temple area, try to get a sheep from there, from A to B, without a blemish. Through these narrow streets in Jerusalem, they were bumping into each other, and of course then the priest would say, can't accept that lamb. So what Caiaphas did is he said, well, you know what? Let's help these people. Let's bring the sale of these lambs inside the forecourt of the temple, so that they don't have to take this whole long trek down from the Mount of Olives. When we sell them inside the temple, it's guaranteed to be warranted by the priesthood. We only sell lambs that are good for slaughter. Well, it sounded good on paper. The problem was that the temple only accepted a form of currency called the Tyrian shekel. There you see it on the picture. And so that meant that if you wanted to buy a lamb on the forecourt of the temple, on the grounds of the sanctuary, you first had to change your Roman currency, your sesterces or your denarii, to the Tyrian shekel. And that's why there are all these stalls in the forecourt. All these people yelling out their currency rate. Here, come here, 1.2 to the dollar, right? And Jesus had come to the temple to give his great sermon, like Jeremiah before him. He was going to give his great sermon that was going to change the hearts of Judea. And he shows up in the forecourt, and instead of a wide, large congregation that he was going to talk to, he sees all this market, all this commerce going on, all this screaming, All this, of course, these animals, they know very well what's in store for them, so you can imagine what was on the ground, right? And that's when he gets frustrated. And that's why he pulls his belt out. So you see how history illuminates some of those things that we read in the Gospels. The indictment. One of the things that always fascinated me as well is why is Jesus, after his arrest, taken to the private home of Caiaphas? What's up with that? That's not the way things are supposed to go. If you were arrested because of blasphemy, in this case, of course, the attack on the money changers, you were supposed to be put in prison at the temple until such time that the complete Sanhedrin, the great Sanhedrin, the Jewish council, could hear your case. That's what happens with all the apostles who are arrested after the Easter events. They're all put in prison, brought in front of the Sanhedrin, and then the Pharisees let them go. The point is that Caiaphas knew that too, that there was a Pharisaic minority on the Jewish council, the Sanhedrin, who would vote to let Jesus go. And that's why he decided to indict Jesus in secret in his own home with a group of hand-picked Sadducees who would do his bidding. There was only one problem with that. Without the backing of the full Sanhedrin, a high priest did not have the right to condemn a man to death. Read the Mishnah, Sanhedrin, a Jewish document, tells us very clearly, if you want to condemn a man to death, you need to have the full backing of the Sanhedrin, which is why the apostles are let go. This ossuary that you see there, which is a collection of the bones, is actually the ossuary of Caiaphas. Caiaphas, who we now know, is a historical figure. It says there, scratch, you can probably not see it, but right there, it says there, Caiapha in Aramaic, Caiapha. So we actually have the tomb, the ossuary of Caiaphas. Well, I wanted to end with, this is a reconstruction of one of the homes, of the priestly homes where we think the indictment was held. But I wanted to leave you with the most beautiful building of ancient times, the largest sanctuary of ancient times, which is the setting for the great story of the Passion that you will be celebrating here in the weeks to come, which is the Jerusalem temple. Now, this place was absolutely incredible. It was the largest sanctuary of its time, bigger even than the Temple of Karnak in Egypt, if you've been there. And I'm just going to, in closing, identify a few things for you that you can still see today, okay? So here is the reconstruction from my book, The Biblical World, and also I think we have it in Archaeology of the Bible. This is the large forecourt. This is where the money changers were attacked by Jesus. This is where he was hoping to preach, and all of this was filled with money changers, sellers of the lamb. And here is this a huge forecourt. This is the Stoa. This is where the great Sanhedrin, the Jewish council, had its sessions. And in order to build this huge complex, which was located on top of a hill, the architects had to raise the entire platform using these supporting walls. Do you see that? These huge supporting walls served to create a level platform on which the sanctuary could be built, because under it was just a hill. So this was all filled in. Well, Israeli archaeologists have now discovered, of course, here is the Western Wall. Let me point that out to you once more. See this supporting wall here, this section right here? That is what remains of this great sanctuary. This is, of course, the famous Western Wall today. Today, it's the holiest part in Judaism. Here's another thing I want to point out for you. What you see here is there were two entrance gates, the Wilson's Arch and Robinson's Arch right here. Now, see this corner right here and this arch right here? Keep that in your mind. All right, got it? That is how it looks today. See? So after the Six-Day War, when Jewish forces, Israeli forces, conquered the old city, All of this, which was covered up by homes, was taken down and excavated. So now we can really see, here is the corner of that temple, and here is the beginning of Robertson's Arch, where the people came in. But the most important place, and this will be my last picture, the most important place is this staircase here. Because we know that Jesus came from Bethany, right? He came from Bethany down to the valley of Kidron and walked up to the temple with his apostles. So this staircase, which was excavated in recent decades, is the one spot in the Holy Land where we know that Jesus walked. Thank you so much for your attention.